This morning, one bill up for discussion is one that would allow some community colleges the chance to offer four-year degrees. Kurt Oldfield, the president of Spoon River College in Macomb, says if it were to pass, he would consider looking at new opportunities.
Part of the bill is designed to avoid any overlap with universities. The programs would be in a specific field with very specific people in mind.
These are students who are not being served currently by our university partners who are really kind of the target audience of our community college baccalaureate degrees, and that they probably could not come to a university and complete their baccalaureate degree online or in person.
State Senator Mike Halpin, who sits on the Higher Education Committee, says if the bill passes, it would take some time before Illinois community colleges could offer four-year programs.
Part of the process is to make sure that the program is needed, it doesn't duplicate our four-year universities, and that the community college has the faculty and resources sufficient to start up a program. It has to be accredited.
Halpin says any program would also first have to be reviewed by the Illinois Board of Higher Education and the Illinois Community College Board.